Hi, and welcome to Introduction to Sociology, Chapter 2 Summary, the Development of Sociology. And in this chapter, we have 5 learning objectives to cover. So first, we're going to describe the origin of sociology, where sociology came from. Secondly, we're going to briefly cover the major theorists of classical sociology, such as Marx, Durkheim, Weber, Adams, Du Bois, and others. Third, we're going to trace the development of sociology in America, the major theoretical schools and perspectives in the American field of sociology. And fourth, we're going to compare the major ideas and concepts of the contemporary sociological theories: structural functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, etc. And fifth, and finally, we're going to explain how each of these theories can be applied in people's personal and professional everyday lives. So let's get started. We will jump into topic 1, the development of sociology. Historically, sociology is less than 200 years old as an official field of science. In other words, it started basically in the 19th century in Europe. And what I can tell you about the rise of sociology is for a particular political and economic reason why sociology as a field of scientific study started in Europe at that time. What was going on in Europe was a transition from one social system to another. In other words, we had been, for thousands of years, been living in a medieval feudal society, a society that was based on the labor of peasants. Peasants would toil the land, and they would give the agriculture they extracted to the nobility, the kings and queens and lords and the aristocracy. And that world was ruled by superstition, by the power of the Catholic Church, who had a monopoly over interpreting society and what people's place in society was. Why are you a poor peasant? Because that's what is ordained by God, right? So in the 19th century in Europe, the feudalist society, that order of kings and queens and all of that, began to break down. And what we saw is the birth of a new system, the capitalist system. And this was a capitalist modern world where we saw an industrial revolution, where technology and the forces of productivity were unleashed. And all of the poor peasants in Europe were forcibly kicked off their land and driven into the cities, where they became the working classes of the modern capitalist world of the Industrial Revolution. So this is the era when religious authority began to be questioned, and what was replacing it was scientific authority, so that science became the primary tool. And this goes hand in hand with the rise of capitalism, because capitalism was based on an industrial revolution, new technologies, new inventions, new machinery, new ways of organizing labor, new ways of distributing and producing goods, the need to travel across the ocean, across the Atlantic into the Americas to find new commodities, new resources to extract in order to sell and to profit from. So this, and of course, new lands to colonize. So this was the need for science, which was replacing religion. Religion was falling by the wayside, and the power of the kings and queens and the Catholic Church was starting to be stripped away. And suddenly, knowledge, truth, reality was being discussed by scientists rather than by medieval religious authorities. So this really is where sociology comes into the picture. For centuries and centuries, going back to the dawn of time, to the dawn of the human race itself, we have been asking questions about how does society work? Who are we? What is our role in the world? But it wasn't until the rise of sociology as a scientific study, the attempt to not just use philosophy or religion or common sense to answer questions about society, but we're saying, hey, we're going to actually do a scientific study of society itself. And so that's really what we would consider the birth of sociology in the 19th century. Now, the man who is officially known as the father of sociology, the first one who came up with that word, sociology, was Auguste Comte. And he was a person who actually really thought of sociology as the queen of the sciences, which I mentioned in the previous chapter. And his whole idea was what he called social physics. He thought, he was comparing sociology to sort of physical science, like physics or chemistry or something, right? And we can study it using those scientific methods in much the same way. His most famous ideas, I'll just briefly mention two. The first one is the law of human progress. And he was looking at how society has evolved over time in different stages. Now, what Comte argued in the law of human progress was that society has evolved in three stages in terms of history. First stage was the theological stage. Theological meaning religious. And that means he saw in early societies, in the medieval feudal societies, it was a society based on religion, the authority of the church, the Catholic priest and the Catholic bureaucracy was who told you what the truth was about the universe. And if they said it because of God ordained it, or the Bible ordained it, or the Catholic authorities ordained it, that was the truth. Now, this evolved into what the second stage that Comte called the metaphysical stage. You might also think of this as the philosophical stage. What he was thinking of here is kind of after religious authority, but before science really took over. It was a kind of philosophical. This is kind of the age of enlightenment, where people are asking questions. And they're not using necessarily the tools of scientific method to ask those questions there, but they are questioning things in a different way than the old religious authorities were. They were actually thinking, using their own brains, using philosophy to try to question the universe and why things exist. Okay, and then that led to the third stage, which for Comte is the scientific stage. And he also called this the positive stage. So the type of sociology that we refer to coming from Comte is called positive sociology or positivism. And his idea here was, of course, that we've passed from religion, then we go to philosophy, and then finally it leads to science. Science is the final answer. It's the ultimate decider of the truth, because we're using research and facts and material evidence, empirical evidence. Okay, so that was the law of human progress, the three stages. Another big idea from Comte is that society has two sides to it that we should study: social statics and social dynamics. So those are the two big ideas that we, to this day, we don't quite use those same words when we talk about this in sociology, but this is a concept that is really interesting and profound. The idea of social statics is where if something is static, that means that it stays the same. It doesn't change. So in this sense, what Comte is talking about is social order. He thinks sociologists should study why society can be static. How can you, day by day, you get up and you know that the roads are going to be there, there's going to be traffic lights, there's going to be police, there's going to be businesses operating, there's institutions, there's schools. How do you know that everything's the same? How come you don't walk out of your room in the morning and there's complete chaos and everything's different? Because there is something that's static, things that have order and control to it. There's sort of a structure to it. That's social statics, how things are in order here. He also wanted to look at social dynamics. Now, the word dynamic means something that's different, something that's changing. So social dynamics means social change. He wanted to study, how do things change? How come over time, if we look at society in 2023, it looks different than we look at society in 1100 or thousands and thousands of years before that? Why did society change? How does it change? Right? So those are the two aspects of society that Comte was focused on. The social statics, which is why are things the same, and social dynamics, which is how do things change? So that's really kind of the main big ideas we get from Comte. The next social theorist that we're going to look at is a man named Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer was an English sociologist, and he was very popularly known for creating a phrase called the survival of the fittest. And his main focus in sociology was on evolutionary biology, evolutionary sociology, I should say. What he was doing was, people have this misconception that Charles Darwin, with the theory of evolution by natural selection, people assume that Darwin came up with this term, survival of the fittest. But that's not at all what Darwin said. It was actually Herbert Spencer. the sociologist who used the term survival of the fittest. He came up with that term, not Darwin. But what Spencer was trying to do was take Darwin's ideas, which were about biology, which were about how animals and species evolve over time in their natural environment. But what Spencer tried to do was take that idea and apply it to society and say society, not just that organisms evolve as species, but us as a society, us as people, as human beings, our society evolved. So he tried to take evolutionary theory and put it into the world of sociology. However, because of this, his ideas are very controversial, and that's something that is, in fact, probably not something that is considered acceptable in sociology by today's time, because he, thought that that his sort of ideas led to a lot of very bad, horrific things later on in the 20th century. For example, the idea that only the strong should survive and only the fittest should be the ones who survive in society leads to a sort of eugenics, which would be that, well, okay, maybe we can just, the people who are poor, the people who are struggling, well, maybe they're just not fit to survive. Maybe they're too weak. Maybe they just need to be gotten rid of. You might also apply this evolutionary view to racial, ethnic, religious groups. For example, the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, the idea that, the Jews were a substandard race that does not need to survive and then can therefore just be wiped out. So this idea of applying the survival of the fittest to a human society can be very problematic and can lead to a lot of negative consequences. So that was the reason why Herbert Spencer's views, to this day, we look at them because they historically were important for sociology at the time, but today they are mostly forgotten and written off as bad. Okay, moving on. The next theorist we're going to look at is Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German Jewish philosopher and revolutionary and sociologist and economist. He really spanned the whole range of human knowledge in a lot of ways. He kind of gave to us the idea of materialist sociology. He took the idea that in terms of common sense, we look at the world as a matter of ideas. Your ideas create reality. Your beliefs, what you think of in your mind, creates reality. Marx thought the opposite. Marx thought that the material world, the real world, the natural physical world we live in, is the basis of reality. And society is based on the fact that we as human beings, in order to survive, we have to produce our means of existence, our sustenance, our food from the natural physical material world, right? The earliest human societies were hunter-gatherers. They survived by using very limited technologies such as Stone Age tools to hunt animals to eat and to wear for clothing, and to forage food from plants. And so for Marx, in order to understand any society, the basis of that is our material world. How do we as a species survive in the material world? How do we produce our existence from the material world? And so he used that to extrapolate a key idea, which is that when hunter-gatherer societies were around, those societies were very egalitarian, mostly peaceful, people living in small groups. There was no real inequality. There was no government. There was no private property or classes. So it wasn't until the birth of agriculture where we started to learn not just to hunt and gather for food, but to domesticate animals as livestock, and then take plants and domesticate them as crops. Well, that led to something unique in human history, which was the rise of class. Okay, because then that allowed one group who had to work in the fields, who had to work in the crops to toil the soil, who had to raise the livestock. That group had to work, and another group could take the crops and the food and the things that they created from agriculture and could hoard it and could have an abundance of material resources. And that led to private property. That led to class division between people who own the land, who own the resources, who own the machines and the tools, and then the people who don't own the land and the machines, the people who only own themselves, and therefore they have to work, they have to labor, they have to go to to work in order to survive based on the people who are the private property owners who own all of the resources. So that was Marx's big idea. And he traced this all the way from the dawn of time, from the big first hunter-gatherer societies, up through the ancient Roman empires, up through the medieval feudalist world, and then to modern capitalist society. And he was using sociology not simply as a pure science, but not also as an applied science. He was doing both. He was using scientific research of society and the history of society in order to apply it to how to change society. And Marx was specifically advocating for the working class. He called the working class the proletariat, which is a word that comes from ancient Rome. The class in ancient Rome who didn't own property, who lived in the city without property, they were called proletarii. So the proletariat for Marx was the modern working class, people who don't own land, they don't own a business, they don't own a factory. The only thing they own is themselves, and they have to go into work for a job to sell their labor power in order to get a wage or a salary so that they can survive. That's the working class. And Marx was arguing that the workers are the ones who create society. They produce society. They produce all the commodities. Their labor builds the wealth of the entire society, but they do not receive the wealth that they created in return. They become what Marx called alienation. They became alienated from society, from the commodities that they create, because they don't control the land, the wealth, the factories, the machines, the resources. The group that does control those things, Marx called them the bourgeoisie, which means the capitalist class. He called them the ruling class. The capitalists own the land, they own the factories, they own the businesses, they have patents on all of the technologies. So capitalists are the ones who take advantage of the labor of the workers, who exploit the labor of the workers in order to increase their own wealth. And so that was Marx's main view of sociology, was that we look at it as a conflict over material production and material resources between the owners, which he called the bourgeoisie or the capitalists, and the laborers, the workers, the proletariat. And his goal was to use sociology to help the proletariat, to help the working class learn how to have liberation, to revolt against the owners, and to create a new society where the workers are the ones who own society, not the bosses, not the capitalists. Marx's ideas, of course, were very popular. They influenced not just other socialist and communist movements around the world, but they also influenced the foundation of sociology, which what we lead to nowadays we would typically call conflict theory. But we'll have more on that later. Next sociologist we'll look at is Émile Durkheim. Durkheim was a French Jewish sociologist, and he was one of that is kind of an opposite perspective of Marx. He was more focused on social order than he was on social revolution and social change and conflict. Durkheim's main focus was on how society holds itself together. How do we as individuals in a complex, diverse society, how do we bound each other up with one another? How are we connected to one another? And Durkheim's main idea, one of his big ideas, was what he called the collective conscience. He argued that when we have all these individuals, what really keeps us together is we have a collective conscience, that I am not just myself, that when I think, I can kind of have this collective psyche that comes not just from me, but from the entire group itself, society itself. And that's where I learn what is right and wrong. What are the norms that I should follow? Why should I drive on this side of the road? Why shouldn't I just walk down the street with no clothes on? How do you know the values, the beliefs, the norms, what role you're supposed to be as a father, as a husband, as a employee, as a, et cetera, as a student? This learning roles, learning values, learning beliefs, learning what norms you should follow, learning what would happen as a sanction if you didn't follow a norm, right? This is where we get the collective conscience. It's this idea that society becomes this mentality that we kind of think in the back of our head. We hear the voice of society. And that's the collective conscience. And that's really what Durkheim is very interested in. Now, his big idea, he really was also influenced by Marx. Durkheim was looking at how society changed from a medieval feudalist society where kind of everyone lived in these small little towns, and typically you would live in that town, born in that town, live in that town, die in that town, and you had the same job your entire life. You were a peasant or you were a blacksmith, right? You just did one thing. And then he looked at, well, here's capitalism. Here's modern society where we have big, massive cities, and everyone you know, your neighbors are not the same as you. They move around. They might live in multiple different places in their lifetime. And not everybody's doing the same job. It's not like you're just working as a peasant your entire life in the same field. Everyone has different jobs, different careers. Everyone is doing different things. So with so much diversity and so much complexity and everyone's so spread out, Durkheim was asking us, how does society even hold itself together at all? And he was really focused on proving that sociology could be the key to answering that question. And he looked at it using the topic of suicide. For Durkheim, suicide was the most individual, private act that a person could take, their own lives. But he wanted to say, look, it's not, religion, it's not psychology, oh, they're just depressed or something. He thought society could be an answer for explaining why people commit suicide. And so the big idea that came from his study of suicide was that this term he called anomie. Anomie is a French word he used. And anomie basically means that a person is unstuck in society. They're, unglued from their role in society. What he had in mind here is that someone doesn't have a good sense of place in the world. They're disconnected, they're isolated, they're alone. They don't, the values and the norms and the beliefs of the society is no longer working to keep that person plugged in, to keep them in their place in society. They're kind of driftless and aimless. And that's something that he saw would lead to higher rates of suicide. And this idea of anomie, of course, it won't just apply to suicide. It can apply to our entire modern condition as human beings living in a modern world, in a modern capitalist world. How do you feel connected to other people when we're all so isolated, when we're all so individualistic, when we're all doing different things and we're not, living in the same town with our extended families for the rest of our lives? That's what Durkheim's interest was in studying, was how does society hold itself together and maintain a sense of cohesion and order? All right, next theorist we're going to look at is Max Weber. Weber was born in Germany in the mid 1800s, and he was a main theorist who kind of went after Karl Marx. He was one who was in some ways influenced by Marx, but people say he argued with Marx. He was arguing with Marx's ghost, in fact, because Marx had already passed away by the time Weber was writing his ideas. But Weber was sort of taking a lot of Marx's ideas, but modifying them in different ways, because Weber's concern was not to be a radical or to be a revolutionary or to try to advocate on behalf of the working class to change society. Weber was more just arguing that we should use sociology as a tool to study society. So one of his main ideas was what we call value-free sociology. Now, this is the idea that of course we all have values, we all have beliefs and things we support or don't agree with. But as sociologists, as scientists, we should put our values on the table and put them aside and use our objectivity to try to study society. So this is in stark contrast with Marx's theory that we should use sociology to study how society works in order to change society, in order to fight on behalf of the working class. Weber was not interested in doing anything like that. His approach was, again, to try to make a society that was value-free, a sociology that was value-free. And he also used a German word for this he called Verstehen, which is his approach to studying sociology, which means interpretation. And that was the idea that you can't really discover these big economic laws or forces of history. You just have to focus on trying to understand, to interpret and understand something in society. So again, Weber, a bit different than Marx, he wasn't wanting to use the scientific method, use sociology for purpose of changing society and changing these social conflicts between the workers and the capitalists. He was interested in how do we understand society, how do we interpret society, and of course, how can we put our values to the side so that we can look at it as value-free sociologists. Okay, so those are the main figures in classical sociology, which was in the 17, 18, early 20th century. We can then move on to our topic, which is how did sociology develop in America? The main earliest school of sociology in the United States was in 1893 at the University of Chicago. And this was called the Chicago School of Sociology because it wasn't just that one university, but the kind of way of doing sociology, the way of thinking about sociology that spread all across the United States was really based on how they were doing things at the University of Chicago at that early time. One of the leading figures was a man named Robert Park, and he wrote many of the early textbooks on how to do sociology. One of their main focuses of the Chicago School was what they called social ecology. And what that meant is that, Chicago was an urban area, lots of poverty, lots of ethnic groups, lots of immigrants, labor movements, all that stuff was going on. And they wanted to use kind of this, go into a community and study these urban areas, study these urban communities, kind of go in and participate in the events and observe and kind of watch what's happening and kind of take account of the small group that they're participating in that time. So that was a big focus on the Chicago School, was what they called social ecology, the study of these different urban communities and urban populations. Another important figure in the foundation of early sociology in America was a woman named Jane Addams. She was around in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And she was the founder of something called the Hull House. The Hull House was America's first settlement house for the immigrant population in Chicago. And a lot of the Chicago school professors would come to the Hull House to study these different ethnic groups, these different immigrant groups and working class groups. So Jane Addams was really a mixture of kind of like a social worker and a sociologist. She would do research on the different immigrant groups and their struggles and what they needed to integrate into society. She also provided resources through the Hull House to help house them and provide opportunities for them. And she was also in the 1930s given the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. And I think she's probably the only sociologist who has ever gotten the Nobel Peace Prize. Another very important American sociologist in the 19th and early 20th century is W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois has the distinction of being the first Black person to achieve a PhD from Harvard University in sociology, or first Black person to receive a PhD from Harvard across the board. But his focus was on sociology. And he also founded the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And he worked for political rights for African Americans. He was also primarily focused on studying what he called the color line, which was the division in America between the Black worker and the white worker. And he saw that as the key problem to be overcome in the 20th century. And so his research was focused heavily on Black urban populations, racial dynamics in America, and things of that nature. He was very influential in sociology in the United States. Okay, so that kind of concludes the section of this chapter where we're talking about the classical sociologists, or again, the early ones who founded the field. Now we're going to move on to discuss the contemporary sociologists, or should I say the contemporary sociology theories that are popular and that are used widely today in our modern times. So the first one we're going to talk about is what we call structural functionalism. Now this you can kind of trace back to the early years with people like Durkheim, who was interested in how does society maintain its order. Structural functionalism looks at everything in society as a structure. It has its own foundation to it. It's its own structure that holds it in place. And it also looks at every structure, every institution in society has a certain function. What is the function of the religious institution, right? What is the function of the economic institution? What is the function of the education system? every single institution in society has a certain function it serves. And they use an analogy kind of to a biological organism, right? What does your heart do? It pumps blood. What does your brain do? It allows you to think. What does your lungs do? They breathe air, right? Every organ in your body system has its own structure to it, and it does a certain function to help you as a single living being survive. Well, structural functionalism looks at society in that way too. Every institution in society maintains order. It has a function that it serves. It has a certain purpose. And we all need these institutions for society to hold itself up. Now, the big critique of structural functionalism is that it doesn't explain social conflict. It doesn't explain social change. And it doesn't ask questions, well, what, are these institutions actually, what kind of function? Who do they serve? What are these functioning institutions doing? Are they functioning on behalf of the people, the working class, or are they functioning on behalf of the capitalist class, the ruling class, right? The elite. So that's a question that leads us to what we call conflict theory. This other major contemporary sociological theory is called conflict theory, because it's sort of rooted in it originated with Karl Marx and his work on, studying economic systems. And the conflict theory looks at society more from a focus of constant change and conflict between different groups in society in order to gain control over how we produce our survival or material resources or status. It's a constant struggle for different groups, economic groups, political, religious groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, national groups. And so the major focus of conflict theory is social change and social conflict between groups. The critique of it comes from structural functionalists. Well, they say, if you're only focusing on the conflict in society, you're not looking on the order. Society has order. Society has rules. Society has all these different institutions. If everything was just constant change and conflict, well, we wouldn't have any stability at all, would we? Right? So those two perspectives, the structural functionalist and the conflict perspective, they kind of are two sides of the opposite coin to each other. A third major contemporary theory is what we call symbolic interactionism. Now, this is a focus where the level of analysis is at the small level, the micro level of analysis. Micro meaning it looks at the interactions between everyday people, face-to-face interactions between everyday life, between ordinary people. It doesn't look at large-scale national, political, economic systems. It's everyday interactions between people. And it's the two parts of the word, symbolic and interaction. Those are both what it looks at. When we interact with people, that's where you and another person meet face-to-face and communicate and exchange symbols with each other. Now, what are symbols? Symbols are something that has meaning. It has an idea behind it, right? So just language, communication. When we talk to someone, we are exchanging symbols. We are interacting with one another, and we are sharing this idea, these symbols, these words that have meaning. So for symbolic interactionism, we really look at the human ability to use symbols to interact with each other based on symbolic thought, abstract thought, words and sounds and actions that have ideas behind, that have meaning. That's the basis of how society is formed, is through individual people sharing ideas back and forth. That's the symbolic interactionist theory. The next theory is exchange theory. And exchange theories attempt to look at human behavior in society in terms of costs and benefits, or rewards and costs. It's sort of like calculating everything you do in life is an exchange. You're either when you interact with somebody, you're either going to get something that you benefit out of that interaction, or you're going to get something that you lose out of that interaction. So all we're doing at all times is trying to get a reward and try to avoid a punishment, try to get a benefit from something and try to avoid a cost. So everything in our society is an exchange between fighting for resources for, I want this reward and I don't want to lose anything or have to pay a cost for anything. That's sort of how they view the entire basis of society itself. And finally, the last perspective in modern contemporary sociology theory we're going to look at is evolutionary theory. And this, kind of, we talked about the earliest sociologists like Comte and Spencer did talk about stages of society, progress, evolution, survival of the fittest. Well, contemporary times is a little bit different, but it uses an analogy like similar to biological organisms, how they evolve from single cell organisms to complex organisms. The evolutionary theory thinks the same thing in society. We started out as a simple hunter-gatherer societies and small tribes, and now we've gone to this massive capitalist global industrial society. So society changes through different stages and gets increasingly complex. So that's sort of the main idea. Society is evolving. Society goes from simple societies to more and more diverse, complex, complicated societies. Okay, so just to now wrap everything up, we, in conclusion, have covered a lot of ground in this chapter. This is a difficult one. So I appreciate y'all staying with me here. We've covered the origins of sociology in the 19th century and social context of the transition from feudalism to capitalism that gave rise to sociology. Next, we summarize the major classical theorists of sociology: Comte, Durkheim, Marx, Weber, Adams, Du Bois. Third, we kind of looked at the American sociology, like the Chicago School, and how sociology was founded in America. Then we looked at the contemporary sociology theories: structural functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and how we look at those today. All right, and that concludes our lecture on chapter 2 of the Intro to Sociology.